Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 277, The Tree That Wasn't. Well, hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in some of the stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, my gosh, I've just realized I'm all out of tree puns. What am I going to do?
Well, you could try 2 or 4. I mean, if you don't have tree puns, why don't you just try?
I'll try a 2x4.
Try a 2x4. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I'll see if I can root out the problem there.
Let's branch off in another direction.
Indeed. This is episode 277, the show notes of which are available at ihose.co/Trifles277. This is one of those master's class episodes where we look back at a particular piece of well-done Sherlockian scholarship. And this is the kind of thing that we think everybody should have access to, whether or not you have read the piece or subscribed to where it came from in the first place. So it's our chance to kind of resuscitate some of this old and classic scholarship and put it before you. If you'd like to correspond with us about it and give us any feedback, you of course can comment directly on the show, on the show notes that we gave you, that link there. You can also write to us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com, and we ask that you do support us in whatever way is possible. We make it possible to do it through Patreon if you are so inclined, and at the end of every month we do a drawing for kind of a mystery prize pack of back issues of the Baker Street Journal. All of our Patreon supporters are eligible to be part of that drawing. And that also makes you eligible to be part of a quarterly drawing where we give away a year's subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So check that out by becoming a patron of Trifles. Well, Bert, spring must have sprung because we are in an arboreal mood this month as we continue to release our Trifles episodes. You recall that in the last episode, we did part 2 of our discussion about trees from the botanical Holmes, the first one having occurred, I think, in episode 274. So we are continuing that theme with The Tree That Wasn't. This is a piece that was written by Nicholas Utechin. This is taken from the book Occasionally to Embellish, some writings on Sherlock Holmes. It was put out by our friends at Gasogene Books and the Wessex Press. We'll have a link to this book in the show notes. This is an article that Nick wrote 50 years ago. This was for the Baker Street Journal in 1972, volume 22, number 4. And it actually holds up quite well, I thought. And this is one of the reasons I think you selected it to be part of our Master's Class series.
Indeed. You know, there's so many reasons for looking at, and really anything that Nick Utechin has written. He's just contributed so much to the world of Sherlockian literature. But one of the common complaints, observations conversations I wind up having with people when I wind up talking about the great game. And of course, the purpose here of these particular episodes is to encourage our listeners to, get involved and try their own hands at some of this stuff. But one of the common conversations I wind up having is people say, Sherlock Holmes Journal, the Baker Street Journal, all those years, all those stories, everything has been done. Well, this is a lovely essay for a variety of reasons, not least of which it shows you what happens when you can revisit a topic where you would think everything has been done. But no. Because of Nick's imagination and writing, you find a unique new take on it. But Nick begins right with that point. He says, nobody has ever suggested Colonel Sebastian Moran did not murder the Honorable Ronald Adair. That seems to be accepted by everyone. But nobody, he says, seems to be satisfied with exactly where Moran was when this crime took place. And then he reviews, at least 4 of the major essays that have been written. 1947, there was a Baker Street Journal story, Baker Street Journal essay. 1948, another one. Edgar Smith wrote an opinion in 1955. Tupper Bigelow in 1959. So he says, look at all these points of view. Well, then we're off. And he says,
and before you move on there, I think it's worth pausing here for a moment that Edgar Smith maintained that Colonel Moran climbed a tree in the park, and Tupper Bigelow came up with an anachronistic helicopter. So these are some theories that are really all over the place in terms of where Colonel Moran was when he took that fatalistic shot.
Yes, exactly right. I'm really glad you underscored that. Now, where we are in the layout of London is that we're near the Marble Arch entrance to Hyde Park, we think. But Nick says right away that this house number, where Moran is supposed to be and where Ronald Adair is supposed to be, this number 427, is an obvious fabrication on Watson's part. And the Marble Arch entrance to Hyde Park, the range would have been much too great for this particular air pistol. But then he quotes, Nick quotes a number of sources about where various people were at this particular number on Park Lane. Watson says, Nick reminds us, that he found himself at the Oxford Street end of Park Lane. And I'm not going to get out of this, he says, by proposing this is just another one of Watson's notorious mistakes. I will just say that Watson writes the Oxford Street end of Park Lane, and that means the half of Park Lane nearer to Oxford Street. Well, number 40 falls in that half.
Yeah, and I think it's a wonderful read of something that's right there before our eyes. Right? We could all look at, Oxford Street end. Well, it's not the end, but it is towards the end of Park Lane. That is, it's an astute observation by Nick, and all you have to do is pull out a map or simply go to Google Maps or something like that to orient yourself as to how this might work. So I think it's again just a little bit of detail, a trifle, as we say around these parts, that makes a huge difference.
Nick puts his finger on the whole issue here. He says, look, what about this strategically placed tree in Hyde Park that was supposedly there? The shooting took place somewhere between 10 p.m. and 11:20. There would still be plenty of people passing on Park Lane between those times, and Moran would have to have positioned himself in a tree right up against the railings that separated the pavement from the park, because otherwise the branches of the intervening trees would have made the shot more difficult. So are we really supposed to believe that Colonel Moran, not a thin man, and carrying an air gun, swarmed up a tree opposite Adair's room, a tree that was perfectly visible from the pavement despite the darkness because of its proximity, while gentlemen and their ladies were returning from the theater and street hawkers were still selling their last boxes of matches and policemen were strolling their beats and hansoms and carriages were passing all the time. Because remember, there was a cab stand not 100 yards from the Adair residence, and nobody noticed a portly, mustachioed gentleman climbing up and squatting in a tree?
Yeah. It does kind of strain credulity to imagine the colonel in his evening attire doing that. And, this is a crack shot. He's a trained professional, and I don't think he would have left anything to chance, and you really wouldn't have understood, exactly what kind of path you had at the window, if that's indeed where Adair ended up showing up eventually, without getting up there first and scoping it out. And I can't imagine, I really have a hard time imagining the colonel testing this out a few nights in a row. This seems more like it's half well planned and half done as a bit of circumstance. Because remember, the colonel was badly losing at cards, and he got to a point where he knew he needed to make a move here. It's not something that would have taken weeks and weeks of planning.
Mm.
So ultimately, Nick comes to the conclusion, the inescapable conclusion, that Moran must have been standing on the pavement, must have taken the shot from the pavement, and standing on the Hyde Park side of Park Lane.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
it wasn't a particularly wide thoroughfare at the time, and he's got a book by John Betterman that shows that Park Lane was not particularly wide. So the opposite of the second floor, or third floor for Americans, would mean that he would have had a shot if Adair came close to the window, showed his head. It would have been easy to hit him through that open window.
Yeah. And we have a very convincing recreation in Nick's words of what actually happened. Bear in mind, too, that Moran's weapon, could be presumed to be a walking stick, because we know what it looks like when it features later on in the capture of Moran. So there's Moran standing against the railings, lounging languidly with what appeared to be a walking stick. And it's nighttime, so nobody's going to notice any peculiarities around the stick. The colonel waits. He watches the passers-by until he saw the glimmer of light, which told him that his quarry was in the room. He paused. He checked the breech. He waited again. A figure appeared at the window, starkly outlined against the light of the room. Moran raised his gun, and with a quick glance around to make sure that nobody was too close, dispatched a soft revolver bullet at the head of his victim. And if anybody did see him, what did they see? They saw an elderly gentleman waving his walking stick at some houses. And the outline staggered.
You sticking houses!
Yeah. The outline staggers back from the open window, and Ronald Adair is dead.
And more on exactly what Nick thinks happened right after this quick word. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011, in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Now, just as a postscript here to the conclusion that that Moran shot Adair from the ground, Nick says the crowning proof would be a doctor's report on the angle at which the bullet entered Adair's head. If it's straight on at the forehead, horizontally, then Nick says, my case collapses, and yet I believe I've shown that the difficulties put forward by some are not unanswerable. I hold a strong card in my hand where I can call on Sherlock Holmes himself to back me. And then we get into another figure that was around and ascertaining exactly who this figure was. He says the curious case of the man with the colored glasses. And this is suggested by Susan Dollinger in Shades of Sherlock, number 16 from July 1970. The tall, thin man with colored glasses, who Watson saw outside the Adair house the day after the murder, was Barker, Holmes's hated rival upon the Surrey shore. And then she tries to make the point that the combination of tinted spectacles and being a detective puts the issue beyond doubt. But Nick says she didn't include the full quotation, which is Watson only strongly suspects, italicized, the man of being a plainclothes detective. Colored glasses alone are not strong enough, a strong enough foundation upon which to build a case. So why is a plainclothes detective going to stand around talking to bystanders? And if he's going to try to benefit from the ideas of the crowd, is he working on the case? But Nick says Miss Dollinger's case breaks down that when he says Holmes knew Barker, yet said he was in great danger at the time. And that's, Nick says, something that was overlooked, that there's no mention of the problem that he's about to pose in the annotated Sherlock Holmes, which at the time was probably the creme de la creme of Sherlockian reference materials.
Yeah, and Nick does a masterful job of wrapping this issue up here. Now, just to make clear to our listeners, the issue here is, when you look at the case of the empty house, in the beginning, Watson tells us, he sort of followed crime and he noticed the murder of Ronald Adair, and he inspected the locale himself. And as he did that, he saw this tall, thin man with colored glasses, which, Watson suspects being a plainclothes detective. And so what Nick is doing here is he's trying to tell us a little bit more about exactly who this person was. And he starts building his little chain of logic here by quoting Holmes in his conversation after his identity's been revealed and he's returned in the empty house. When he was dressed as the old bookseller, Holmes says to Watson, I turned away from you because I was in danger at the time, and any show of surprise and emotion on your part might have drawn attention to my identity. So, the man with the tinted spectacles that Watson had observed in Park Lane, was this mysterious gentleman that Holmes did not want to have his disguise penetrated, that this mysterious gentleman was someone that Holmes did not want to know that he was back in London. Now, who could that be? Well, says Nick, the majority of the Moriarty Group members had been arrested in May 1891, and they wouldn't be out of prison, and it would be no common thug hired by Moran to be a lookout. So how about thinking that this man with the tinted spectacles was Colonel James Moriarty, the professor's brother? We know, he says, the professor had been extremely tall and thin. His brother might equally have been so.
Well, that's interesting. Although I don't know how Holmes would have recognized Colonel Moriarty by sight, but that's neither here nor there. Nick writes that the colonel was of a criminal bent. We know that because he had previously tried to defend his brother's actions, Professor Moriarty. But why wouldn't Moran have enlisted the Moriarty brothers' assistance? I mean, we knew him to be sympathetic, and Moriarty would have had more reason than most to wish Holmes dead, and maybe the brothers Moriarty were quite close, and this was the ultimate act of vengeance to avenge his brother's death. But Colonel Moriarty, it was in Park Lane for the possible appearance of Sherlock Holmes, showing off his own qualities as an actor while he did so. Colonel Moriarty it was who, had he recognized Holmes, would have undoubtedly followed and tried to murder him. Therefore, it was absolutely vital that Watson should not recognize Holmes.
Oh, it's just a lovely piece of work. And to give our listeners an idea of how inventive Nick has been, he did come back in 1994 and offer another paper that was delivered, I think, actually at the Back to Baker Street conference with the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, which also further developed this idea of this mysterious gent with the glasses and what was going on in Holmes's motivations. But all of that, well, that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.